across to Washington, speak to our correspondent Kethevane Gorjestani. Kethevane, talk us through notable moments from the state visit so far.
Well, there were three major moments at the White House for the Indian Prime Minister. There was this very long bilateral with Joe Biden, where the two men exchanged on a multitude of issues. That was followed by a very rare for the Indian Prime Minister press conference, where Narendra Modi took questions from both the U.S. and Indian press, where he was pressed by a U.S. journalist about discrimination, about human rights issues in his country, criticism that he totally dismissed outright, claiming there is absolutely no discrimination in India. But of course, this state visit was capped by the magnificent state dinner. There were about 400 guests in that pavilion, a big tent that was laid out on the south lawn of the White House, with guests including members of the Indian American community, notable members of that community, and the two men really focusing on the strengthened partnership. One big announcement today was a huge deal for the military, GE signing an agreement with an Indian state-owned company to build jet engines in India. All of this, of course, with the United States trying to get India on their side, to make a team for two main reasons: to sort of get India away from the Russians, given what is happening in Ukraine, and of course to stand up to the competition of China, especially in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, let's pick up on that, because this is interesting, isn't it? Because you mentioned, first of all, the human rights issues. We've had several Democrats boycotting the address, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. On the other hand, we've seen Modi doing yoga on the lawn of the UN at New York. We've seen him giving a rock star treatment in the streets with fans of screaming his name, and also having dinner with the Bidens. But this is about a pivot away from China. This is a lot to do with trade. Talk us through perhaps the thinking of the Biden administration here.
Well, there's an idea that India is going to be the key partner going forward in the next 10, 15, 20 years. And it seems that the strategy of the Biden administration is focusing on that partnership when it comes to Russia, when it comes to China, even if that means at times at least publicly toning down the criticism on human rights. That said, the White House was adamant that this issue was brought up by the U.S. president, and he did mention it in all the times he spoke. He had subtle nudges, subtle indications that this was an issue that he wanted to put forward, talking about how both India and the United States were strong democracies, but that democracies had to fight to protect religious minorities, to protect freedom of speech, to protect freedom of the press. And these were all subtle nudges to the Indian Prime Minister. But the goal of the White House was to say, we're not going to talk down to India. We're not going to scold India. We believe that respectful dialogue between these two leaders is more effective than scolding India in public. And you saw Narendra Modi during his speech in Congress addressing those criticisms, because a big chunk of his speech was talking about democracy, talking about the strength of the Indian democracy. And he also talked about how the United States sometimes had challenges with its democracy, and that India was a little bit similar. So there was some back and forth, but there is really a balancing act for the United States and for the Biden administration to be seen as this administration that is fighting for human rights and freedom of speech, while at the same time understanding that they need some of these partnerships, and sometimes that means not directly criticizing your partners.
Kethevane, great to have your context on what these seems to be an apparent new BFFs on the Indian and US side. Kethevane Gorjestani, our correspondent in Washington.